May 18, 1985. A plane from London lands at a Moscow airport. One of the passengers is a high-ranking KGB officer. His name is Oleg Gordievsky, a colonel of state security and the head of the KGB residency in London. An extremely successful career for a comparatively young man. Gordievsky is only 46. For the last 12 years, he has been the most valuable spy for the British intelligence service. At Sheremetyevo Airport, no one meets the KGB colonel. Very strange. Given his high rank, his directorate should have sent a car with a driver. Gordievsky is nervous. The only thing that calms him is one thought. If the KGB wanted to arrest a traitor, they would have done it the moment he disembarked. The colonel gets into a taxi and heads to his apartment on Lenensky Prospect. The British spy does not yet know that 2 hours earlier counterintelligence officers from the KGB had been to his flat. They thoroughly searched the apartment, installed bugs under the wallpaper and behind the skirting board, put microphones on the phone and cameras in a light fixture. Finally, they treated Gordievsky's clothes and shoes with a special radioactive powder. The concentration was not dangerous to health, but it allowed them to track his movements with a Geiger counter. Gordievsky climbs to the 8th floor, opens 2 locks, but the door won't open. The 3rd lock, installed when the building was constructed, is engaged. During his entire life in that apartment, Gordievsky had never used it. He doesn't even have a key. That means only one thing. His colleagues from the KGB earlier broke into the apartment, searched it, installed bugs, and on their way out locked all the locks. Gordievsky realizes he is being watched and suspected of espionage. The KGB knows how to extract information from people, so the chances that the colonel will be lucky and return to London as if nothing happened are minimal. The only possible punishment for a Soviet security officer caught working for foreign intelligence was the death penalty. Oleg Gordievsky knew this well. The 20th century produced many astonishing stories connected to the work of secret services around the world. But if one were to choose the most incredible story, it would be the story of Oleg Gordievsky. For the KGB, it was one of the major failures. For Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, it was the most successful operation against the Soviet Union. This story has unpredictable turns and an amazing finale, complicated characters, and decisions on which not only their lives, but the fate of all humanity could depend. The Committee for State Security is a legendary organization. Assessments of its activities vary so widely that a universe could fit between opposing views. But what neither supporters nor opponents of the KGB will deny is its influence on the life of the country and the world. Part of the image of the omnipresent Committee for State Security is tied to the organization structure. The KGB handled counterintelligence, foreign intelligence, operational investigative activities, border security, the fight against crime. And this list is far from exhaustive. In many Western countries, each of these functions was performed by separate agencies. In the Soviet Union, there was one all-powerful Committee for State Security. At the peak of its existence, the organization employed more than 1 million people, officers and informant agents. And yet the KGB was truly an exclusive club. As a rule, you didn't choose this work, it chose you. For most people, a career in the KGB began during or shortly after their student years, when recruits were approached by agency officers. In a sense, Oleg Gordievsky was born a Chekist. His father, Anton, was a devoted communist and an employee first of the NKVD and later of the KGB. Anton Gordievsky's career peaked in the late 1930s. Mass repressions and other controversial pages of the Soviet security service's history did not shake the officer's faith. Anton always said the NKVD never made mistakes. Oleg was born in 1938. He was the second child. 6 years earlier, the family's first son, Vasily, was born. One could perhaps trace the origins of the future British spy Gordievsky in his mother, who did not share her husband's belief in the NKVD's infallibility, or in his grandmother, who secretly christened the elder son Vasily against the father's wishes. But the real shift in values occurred later. In the 1950s, after finishing school, Oleg was a typical product of the Soviet system, an active Komsomol member, an athlete, and an excellent student who graduated with a silver medal. He entered one of the country's top higher education institutions, GIMO. The institute forged diplomats, academics, public officials, and spies. Jimo's intensive foreign language programs were a direct road to working in the KGB's foreign residencies. That was exactly what Gordievsky wanted. Soviet spies abroad were of two types, legal and illegal. The former were officers who worked abroad under official diplomatic cover, consular staff, various attaches, accredited journalists, while mainly performing KGB tasks. Illegals had no official status. They were sent under false names with forged documents. Like legal spies, they recruited agents, gathered secret data, or remained as so-called sleepers who could be activated in case of war or major conflict. Vasily Gordievsky was one of the illegals. He began his KGB career while his younger brother was a student at MGIMO. It was Vasily who hinted to his boss that his brother Oleg was skilled at foreign languages and interested in working for state security. After an interview at Lubyanka, the younger Gordievsky was offered a 6-month internship with the KGB. Oleg went to work as a cover translator at the embassy in East Berlin. His first assignment was a meeting with a woman who had been a KGB informant. Gordievsky's task was only to establish contact and ensure the informant wished to continue cooperating. By his account, it was a short, boring conversation. Only later did he realize the meeting was a test, not for the informant, but for him. Decades later, Gordievsky would recall that serious cracks in his Soviet worldview began while at university. Even if true, that was only part of it. He knew about the Hungarian uprising of the 1950s, which Soviet tanks suppressed, and he had seen the Berlin Wall being erected. His student years fell during the Khrushchev thaw and the denouncement of the Stalin cult. Nevertheless, after returning from his internship in Germany, Oleg Gordievsky decided to become a full-fledged KGB officer. One main reason was that working for the committee gave prestige and, importantly for him, the chance to work abroad. That was Gordievsky's goal. After all, he was barely in his 20s. He wanted to see the world. He wanted adventure. Future KGB spies underwent specialized training. They were taught the craft of intelligence and counterintelligence, how to recruit and handle agents, weapons handling, hand-to-hand combat, how to detect surveillance, how to evade surveillance, how to conduct surveillance, how to drop or retrieve dead drops, how to do all that and much more without revealing they were Soviet spies. Such skills were essential for effective KGB work abroad. Their duties could also include not entirely ethical operations such as disinformation, political manipulation, abductions, and killings. All recruits who successfully completed training swore an oath to faithfully serve their homeland to the last drop of blood. Oleg Gordievsky did the same. In the summer of 1963, he took his first full post within state security. To his disappointment, he did not receive the coveted assignment to a Western country. Instead, he was kept in Moscow. In a modest office at Lubyanka, he performed routine paperwork for Directorate S, the KGB division dealing with illegals. The post offered neither thrilling adventures nor foreign travel. Gordievsky understood that one of the major obstacles was his unmarried status. KGB generally did not send single officers abroad. The logic was that a family man was less likely to defect because his wife and children would remain in the hands of the KGB. He met his future wife at mutual friends. Yelena Akopian seemed an ideal candidate, a German teacher who also dreamed of life abroad. Their quick marriage wasn't purely strategic, though romance wasn't its main driver either. After marriage, the chances for both to go abroad increased sharply. For Yelena, a husband's foreign posting would be her pass outside the USSR. After more than 2 years of paperwork at Lubyanka, Gordievsky was offered an overseas post at the KGB residency in Denmark. If one had to choose a single city in the mid-1960s to show a Soviet person all the delights of Western capitalist society, it would probably be Copenhagen, relatively small, clean, beautiful, and prosperous. Close to Andersen's fairy tales and very far from Soviet reality. Officially, Oleg held a consular position. In reality, he was responsible for running illegals in Denmark. By day, he handled visa work. After lunch, he engaged in espionage. He left and retrieved dead drops, transferred money to agents, supervised their work, and reported to his superiors. It sounds like a typical movie spy job, and in part it was. Consider the inventive signals illegals used to communicate with their handlers. An orange peel under a certain bench meant, "I'm in danger." An Apple core left there indicated the agent was leaving the country tomorrow. Such unofficial activity had to be carried out covertly. Danish intelligence understood that some embassy staff were KGB officers, so partial surveillance on them was in place. Eavesdropping on Danish radio communications and other measures were used. Gordievsky's wife Yelena also worked on radio interception thanks to her foreign language skills. At the same time, the residency's work had a less cinematic side: corruption among Soviet officers. Substantial funds were allocated for recruiting informants and for handling them. People willing to hand over sensitive information had to be taken to restaurants, given desired presents, and offered other perks. Instead, many KGB officers fabricated signs of activity, wrote fictitious reports, and pocketed the money. Gordievsky wanted to stand out. He wanted to show his effectiveness to his superiors. He already spoke German and Swedish and, after being posted to Copenhagen, immediately began studying Danish. Only a few of his colleagues on the ground knew the language. Most importantly, Gordievsky actively carried out his primary duties running illegals and sought to recruit valuable agents. The head of political intelligence in Copenhagen, Mikhail Lyubimov, noted the new residency officer's diligence and conscientiousness. One of the main reasons Gordievsky tried to impress his bosses was his strong desire to continue working abroad. He loved Denmark, Copenhagen, and Western life, the variety of goods, music, books unavailable in the USSR, and other freedoms. Once Gordievsky discovered a red light district in Copenhagen with adult shops and magazines, including gay magazines. Having seen nothing like it before, the Soviet officer studied the images with interest. Danish intelligence, watching him, suspected Gordievsky of homosexuality. That suspicion was a good leverage point for blackmail and subsequent recruitment. Gradually, the Danes began to build a case on Gordievsky. In their files, he was codenamed Uncle Kormsen. After a couple of years in Copenhagen, significant shifts occurred in the young residency officer's worldview. His marriage began to fall apart. Despite Oleg's attraction to freedom and Western values, his views on family and the role of women were fairly conservative. His wife Yelena, by contrast, could be called a feminist of her time. She clearly did not see herself as a submissive homemaker. Eventually, Yelena confessed that before leaving Moscow, she had secretly had an abortion. Meanwhile, dramatic political changes were happening across Eastern Europe. The democratic reforms in Czechoslovakia in 1968, known as the Prague Spring. Gordievsky followed the events closely and sympathized with the reformers. He did not know that his elder brother Vasily was, at that moment, in Czechoslovakia as an illegal agent. Vasily was one of those the KGB had sent to sabotage liberalization, engaged in disinformation, pressure, and abductions. The Prague Spring ended in August 1968 when Soviet and other Warsaw Pact troops entered the country. Gordievsky was dismayed. One reason he felt deeply for what was happening was his closest university friend Stanislav Kaplan. After studying in Moscow, Kaplan had returned to Czechoslovakia and worked in intelligence. During the Prague Spring, he sided with the reformers. Gradually, professional problems began for Gordievsky. Danish intelligence increased surveillance on him. They even tried to play the homosexuality card and sent a fellow agent to seduce him. The move failed. First, Gordievsky was cautious and quickly cut off contact. Second, he wasn't gay. Nevertheless, the record of Danish activity on Gordievsky reached the KGB. For them, it was a signal. The Danes likely discovered that he was not a mere consular employee. The leadership suspended all his illegal activities and informed him he would be transferred to Moscow in a few months. It was a difficult homecoming. After 3 years in capitalist Copenhagen, Oleg Gordievsky found himself back in socialist Moscow. The contrast struck him as deeply unfavorable to his homeland. He again took a post in Directorate S, where he had worked before his Denmark assignment. The new post was a modest promotion, but for Gordievsky it was no cause for joy. He again wanted a foreign posting. It's unclear when such an opportunity would arise, had two events not intervened. First, a major KGB embarrassment. Second, the sudden death of his brother Vasily. In 1971, there occurred the largest expulsion of KGB officers in Britain's history. The British declared over 100 people persona non grata whom they suspected of working for Soviet intelligence. The trigger was the defection of Oleg Lyalin, a KGB officer in Britain who exposed many colleagues. Because Danish services cooperated closely with the British, the expulsions affected 3 KGB officers in Copenhagen who worked under diplomatic cover. Thus, a vacancy opened for head of political intelligence in Denmark. But Directorate S management did not want to release Gordievsky. Their decision changed when Gordievsky's brother Vasily died suddenly. The elder Gordievsky had spent most of his career as an illegal in various countries. He developed serious alcohol problems, which led to his death at 39. After that, Directorate S decided to let Gordievsky go. The only remaining obstacle could have been visa issuance. Danes might deny entry to a diplomat if they suspected he was an intelligence officer. Given the active surveillance on Gordievsky during his first posting, such suspicion was plausible. Nonetheless, Gordievsky was granted a visa. Either the suspicions were insufficient, or there was another reason. After the Prague Spring collapse in 1968, intelligence officer Stanislav Kaplan fled. He traveled on vacation to Bulgaria and disappeared, later turning up in France where he surrendered to the Canadian authorities. Canadian services had close ties to British MI6, and they interrogated the defector. He gave names of around 100 people of interest to Western intelligence. The majority were Czechs, and only a few were Soviets. One of them, Oleg Gordievsky. Kaplan knew his best university friend well. They both loved running, courted girls together, and debated freedom. Kaplan believed Gordievsky might agree to cooperate with Western services. Thus, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service began to develop a potential agent codenamed Sunbeam. Behind the codename was Oleg Gordievsky. Given the close cooperation between Danish and British services, granting the new diplomatic visa to Gordievsky looks logical. Perhaps MI6 wanted to recruit a valuable agent. At the end of 1972, the Gordievsky couple returned to Copenhagen. This time, Oleg had a higher post. Officially, he was a second secretary at the Soviet embassy. Unofficially, he headed political intelligence in the Danish KGB residency. He no longer managed illegals. The new work was subtler. Political intelligence sought potential informants and agents among Danish politicians, public figures, journalists, diplomats, and others whose information might interest the Soviet Union. Political intelligence also engaged in influence operations, disinformation, and propaganda aimed at casting the USSR in a positive light and the West negatively. But the Danish residency produced modest results. The reasons were not only laziness and corruption among some officers, but also the Danish mentality. Locals were reluctant to cooperate with the KGB. Even Danish Communist Party members were not ready for outright betrayal. Despite this, Gordievsky persisted in active work and demonstrated his zeal and diligence to superiors. He was promoted to the rank of major. Professionally, Oleg Gordievsky could consider his career successful. By his mid-30s, he had rank and foreign postings. At that rate, by 40, he might head a residency in a Western country. Yet years spent in Moscow between Copenhagen assignments had eroded his loyalty to the Soviet system. He began to see it as corrupt and hypocritical. In Denmark, Gordievsky read Solzhenitsyn and other banned writers. News reached him of his friend Kaplan's defection to the West. He was increasingly close to the point of working for Western intelligence. He did not yet know that Western services were already actively preparing to work with him. Recruiting an agent is a sophisticated art of seduction. On one side, the initiator must show enough interest. On the other, too much pressure will repel the potential recruit. MI6 personnel had met Gordievsky personally. The head of the Danish MI6 residency had crossed paths with him several times at diplomatic receptions. Gordievsky, an avid lover of art and classical music, enjoyed speaking on these topics with Western diplomats, including Britons. To make direct contact, MI6 decided to use a person Gordievsky knew well. Stanislav Kaplan contacted Gordievsky and said he was passing through Copenhagen. Why not meet old friends? Gordievsky agreed, but was extremely cautious. He suspected the surprise appearance of the university friend was not accidental. He didn't know who had sent Kaplan or why. Intelligence services often use the honey trap technique. Its goal is to gain the victim's trust by offering what they need, then expose them. For example, the KGB might send an officer to a foreign diplomat suspected of spying, feigning disillusionment and willingness to leak state secrets. Once an exchange occurred, the diplomat would be exposed and expelled. The Danes or British might attempt similar ruses. At the initial meeting, Gordievsky disclosed nothing compromising, but indicated he wouldn't report the meeting to his superiors, essentially a signal of intent. Later meetings included the head of the Danish MI6 residency, who subtly hinted that the British knew Gordievsky was not a diplomat, but a KGB officer. Gordievsky evaded direct answers, neither confirming nor denying, until finally the MI6 representative went straight to the point. He asked if Gordievsky was ready to cooperate. Oleg skirted the question. The Briton pressed, who heads political intelligence at the KGB residency in Denmark. I do, Gordievsky unexpectedly answered. At that moment, he crossed the line. A KGB officer who had sworn an oath agreed to cooperate with a foreign secret service. He committed treason. In his mind, flashes of the past raced. His father who concealed the unpleasant truths about his work, his mother who did not believe the NKVD's infallibility, the Hungarian uprising, the Berlin Wall, his friend's escape, his love of Western culture, a growing repugnance with the Soviet system, and a belief that the motherland could change. All that made the act of betrayal justifiable, at least in his own head. After officially beginning cooperation with MI6, Gordievsky met his handlers roughly once a month at a safe apartment on the outskirts of Copenhagen. Details of the Operation Sunbeam were tightly classified. MI6 had never worked with an agent so deeply embedded in Soviet state security. Only a very small circle in British intelligence knew of Operation Sunbeam. Very few knew the agent's real name. Danish services continued intermittent surveillance of Gordievsky, as they suspected that some embassy staff were KGB officers. Monthly visits to the safe flat risked attracting attention from Danish agents. Their reports could jeopardize the entire operation. Within the Danish service, only a few senior officials knew of the new valuable MI6 asset. It was decided that on days Gordievsky visited the safe apartment, surveillance on him would be lifted. At first, the British vetted the new agent with many questions to which they already knew the answers. Gordievsky's information not only matched what they knew, it exceeded it. He provided details of internal KGB operations, names, appointments, operational techniques, agent training methods, and even the personal relationships among different officers. Cassettes with recorded conversations were passed by diplomats to Britain. Under international agreements, the luggage of diplomatic staff was not searched, so sensitive material could be secretly transported to MI6 leadership. Over time, the British confirmed Gordievsky was not part of an elaborate KGB provocation. He could be trusted. His information was reliable and abundant. Life for Oleg became like three-dimensional chess. On one side, he needed to show successes to the KGB to secure promotions and access to valuable information to pass to MI6. On the other, he could not be too successful as that might endanger Denmark or other Western states. And of course, he had to ensure his betrayal did not become known within the KGB. Contacts with MI6 had to be as careful and limited as possible. He also shared an apartment with an active KGB officer, his wife Yelena, so if she became suspicious, she would be bound to report him. In the USSR, the fate of a state security officer caught in treason was sealed, death. Amid this already perilous life, Gordievsky fell in love. Layla Aliyeva worked as a typist at the World Health Organization in Copenhagen. Younger than Oleg, she found him experienced, interesting, and well-versed in music and literature. Layla immediately realized Oleg was not merely an embassy employee, but a KGB officer. Her father had been an Azerbaijani state security general, so she grew up around KGB circles. What Layla didn't know was that her lover was simultaneously working for British intelligence. MI6 wanted to increase the flow of information from Sunbeam. Gordievsky possessed an excellent memory and could recount many details, but full copies of KGB documents were the priority. MI6 offered him a mini-camera so he could photograph papers at work. Oleg refused. A single glance from a colleague or discovery of British spy gear would end his career in life. Instead, it was decided he would smuggle materials out during lunch breaks. Documents from Moscow would arrive at the embassy microfilmed. MI6's technical department produced a small portable device for quick copying. Thus, Gordievsky removed materials during lunch, passed them to an MI6 contact who copied and returned them within half an hour. This had to be done with great care. Any damage to the film could compromise the Soviet agent. Gordievsky knew many KGB agents not only in Denmark, but across Western countries. MI6 was tempted to use his information immediately for mass arrests or expulsions, but they opted for patience. They realized a hasty purge would reveal their source. The KGB would quickly trace the leak, and Operation Sunbeam would collapse without revealing its full potential. MI6 preferred to play the long game. The longer Gordievsky remained unsuspected, the higher he could rise in the KGB ladder. British handlers acted cautiously. When Gordievsky informed them about several high-level Norwegian and Swedish officials working for the KGB, MI6 decided that exposing a few Soviet spies outside Denmark wouldn't necessarily implicate the Copenhagen residency or Gordievsky. One exposed spy was Gerver Havik, a longtime employee of the Norwegian Foreign Ministry and an agent with a 30-year career. Despite her long career and numerous meetings with KGB handlers, MI6 judged that limited, strategic exposures would not blow the Gordievsky operation. After several revelations of spies, the KGB considered the possibility of a traitor in high positions. Gordievsky knew this and expected to be unmasked. For weeks he waited to be discovered, but it never happened. Gradually, Sunbeam agreed to accept monetary compensation from MI6. While money motivates many who spy for foreign services, it was not Gordievsky's original motive. Initially, he insisted on no payment, saying his motives were ideological. Later, most of his money went to his British bank account. Gordievsky understood he might never use it. He continued to hide his affairs from his wife and colleagues, used even close friends in the residency to obtain information, smuggled valuable documents at lunch, lied to everyone. Yet for the first time he felt truly honest, a fighter against a totalitarian system. In 1978, Gordievsky learned he would be sent back to Moscow. Rotation was a normal internal practice. With his 40th birthday approaching, they expected him to return with a promotion. But family circumstances intervened. Superiors learned of his impending divorce, which already damaged his reputation, and worse, evidence of infidelity during his time in Denmark surfaced. Thus, Gordievsky was brought back to Moscow for desk work with demotion. Moreover, because of the divorce, he might never be posted abroad again. Before leaving Denmark, Sunbeam asked MI6 to prepare an extraction plan. Such an operation is called exfiltration. But getting someone out of the Soviet Union was almost impossible, and MI6 had never executed such an operation before. If MI6 had needed to exfiltrate Gordievsky while he served in a Western country, it would have been comparatively easy. Exfiltrating from the USSR was another matter. Various schemes were considered, and in the end it was decided to smuggle him out across the Finnish border in the trunk of a British diplomatic car. Diplomatic cars were not officially searched at the border, though that was a tacit understanding, and Soviet border guards could ask to open a trunk. But that was only part of the problem. First, they had to get Gordievsky unnoticed to the border despite KGB surveillance on embassy staff. The plan, codenamed Pimlico, required Gordievsky to signal initiation. Every Tuesday at 7:30 p.m., he was to stand near a specific bakery on Kutuzovsky Prospect, holding a bag from a British supermarket marked with a large letter C. Each Tuesday at 7:30 a.m., British embassy staffer, under the pretext of going to the bakery, would pass that point carrying a Mars or Kit Kat bar. If he saw Gordievsky, the complex exfiltration would begin. The encrypted details of the plan were passed to Gordievsky inside a volume of Shakespeare. He would take the book to Moscow and, if necessary, soak the pages to reveal the operation specifics. Despite all this planning, the chances of the Pimlico plan failing were enormous. Any small detail could go wrong, but it was the best MI6 could offer their most valuable agent in the USSR. For the following 3 years, Gordievsky and MI6 had no contact. The British played the long game, aware that cooperation within the USSR could be effective but short-lived. Most likely the KGB would quickly uncover him. But if they waited for a new appointment abroad for Sunbeam, the payoff would be much larger. Gordievsky was ready to relaunch his career. He divorced, married Layla Aliyeva, and had 2 young daughters. All this negatively affected his career, but he believed he could make up for lost time. Besides his regular work, Oleg began studying English and completed a 4-year KGB course in half the time. In 1981, a vacancy opened in the London KGB residency for deputy head of political intelligence. Gordievsky saw his chance. He hinted to his superiors that he wanted the post, but was not the first choice. The British refused visas to several candidates for the consular spot due to suspicions they were KGB officers. When they received a request to approve a visa for Oleg Gordievsky, MI6 could hardly believe their luck. First, it meant their agent was safe. There had been no news of him for 3 years. Second, the level and quantity of secret information Gordievsky could provide in London would exceed what he had supplied in Copenhagen. The British approved the diplomatic visa for the Soviet embassy officer. Oleg moved to London with his family. His first impression of the British capital was disappointment. He found it louder, dirtier, and less beautiful than Copenhagen. The new leadership greeted the deputy head without enthusiasm. General Arkady Guk was officially the first secretary of the embassy. In reality, he headed the KGB residency in Britain. Gordievsky considered his new boss arrogant, poorly educated, and foolish, but someone who liked to drink. Arkady Guk was utterly convinced the British monitored the Soviet embassy around the clock, tapping phones, installing bugging devices and typewriters, and using other surveillance methods. The London residency thus existed in an atmosphere of paranoia. New staff were viewed with suspicion. Under these conditions, Gordievsky had to reach out to his MI6 handlers. He called the phone number he had been given years earlier in Copenhagen. The first meeting in London looked like a scene from a spy thriller. During his lunch break, he entered an unremarkable hotel lobby where familiar British intelligence officers waited. Without speaking, they moved toward a rear exit. Gordievsky followed at a distance. They drove to a safe apartment not too far and not too close to the Soviet embassy to avoid accidental encounters with other diplomats, yet be accessible during lunch breaks. Thus began a new phase in Gordievsky's work with MI6. During his time in Moscow, he spent hours studying secret KGB documents. Colleagues thought he was demonstrating diligence and seeking promotion. But that was only partly true. Gordievsky tried to memorize as many details as possible to pass on to MI6, especially names of agents the KGB used or intended to use in the West. Gordievsky's information was of enormous value to the British. MI6 had never had such an extensive window into the functioning of the all-powerful KGB. He also reported that the overall state of the main Soviet security service was far less impressive than decades earlier. Many KGB staff were more interested in profit than service. According to Gordievsky, one of the KGB's chief assets in Britain was the chairman of the Labour Party's left wing, Michael Foot. In 1983, Britain was due to hold parliamentary elections, and Labour was a favourite. Had Foot won, he might have become prime minister. Gordievsky claimed to have seen documents in KGB archives indicating Michael Foot had received money from Soviet intelligence. He apparently did not provide secret information in return and was more an agent of influence than a spy. Foot spent the funds on a socialist magazine. After Prague Spring, according to Gordievsky, the politician ceased contacts with the KGB. Technically, he did not break the law, but the information was enough to bury his political career. It remains unclear why this information did not become public in 1982. In any case, a year later, Michael Foot lost to Margaret Thatcher and never became prime minister. His alleged ties to the KGB remain debated in the UK. The early years after Gordievsky's posting to London were the most productive of his MI6 cooperation. He provided the British with numerous secret data, helping to expose Soviet spies across Western countries. But his greatest achievement is considered the prevention of nuclear war. The early 1980s, according to many historians, were the time the world was closest to apocalypse since the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 decades earlier. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov believed the West was seriously preparing for an attack on the USSR with nuclear weapons. All residencies abroad were ordered to find any confirmation of an impending attack. According to Gordievsky, many colleagues in the London residency saw this as paranoid hysteria. Nevertheless, for MI6, Gordievsky's reporting on real sentiments within Soviet leadership was crucial. Neither Britain nor the United States wanted to provoke a conflict that could lead to apocalypse, and they adjusted military plans accordingly. It is believed the intelligence Gordievsky supplied in the early 1980s helped avert nuclear war. His materials were of great value and often reached Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's desk. Thatcher knew of a high-level agent in the KGB, but MI6 did not reveal his identity, even to her. He was known to her as Mr. Collins. In 1984, the young Politburo member Mikhail Gorbachev visited Britain. Thatcher sought to improve relations with the Soviet Union. MI6 used Gordievsky to help prepare and manage the visit. On one hand, supplying details of topics the Soviet side would raise, on the other passing information from Thatcher's side, always covertly and framed as good intelligence work by Gordievsky. The visit was a success. This was one reason why in 1985 KGB leaders decided to appoint Oleg Gordievsky head of the Residency in the United Kingdom. MI6 had actively helped their agent climb the career ladder, providing him with carefully selected useful information that on the one hand didn't jeopardize Western security, but on the other demonstrated his value to the KGB. The British also removed obstacles, e.g., in 1980 they declared Arkady Guk persona non grata under the pretext of espionage. His deputy replaced him, and Gordievsky was promoted to head of political intelligence and a year later became residency chief. The KGB thus had a very valuable agent. Aldrich Ames was not the most successful CIA officer. By the mid-1980s, he held a decent position in the Soviet Affairs Directorate, but was in huge debt, and his young wife liked an expensive lifestyle. He began selling secrets to Soviet authorities. MI6 shared Gordievsky's materials with Allied Western intelligence, including the CIA, but did not reveal the source. For the Americans, this was awkward. Delivering critical intelligence about Soviet nuclear programs to President Reagan without disclosing the source felt unprofessional. The CIA conducted its own investigation using MI6 information, and a process of elimination concluded the source was KGB officer Oleg Gordievsky in London. Aldrich Ames, working in the relevant CIA division, disclosed to Soviet representatives at one of the first meetings that MI6 had a valuable agent in a senior KGB post. He did not yet reveal the name. That was enough to launch one of the most intensive hunts for a traitor in KGB history. The very next day after Ames's meeting with KGB officials, Oleg Gordievsky was summoned urgently to Moscow, officially for a conference with his superiors. MI6 faced a difficult decision. Perhaps the KGB had uncovered Gordievsky and the summons was a pretext for arrest. In that case, he should stay away and surrender to British authorities. But if it was a regular working summons and he returned to his post, MI6 would hit the jackpot. The British warned Gordievsky of the risks, but left the final decision to him. He chose to go. The risk was present, but the potential gain outweighed it. Before leaving, he bid farewell to his wife Layla and their daughters, who still knew nothing of his MI6 ties. Viktor Budanov was responsible for catching the traitor, a man some called the most dangerous in state security. He led the search, the apartment search, and the installation of bugs in Gordievsky's Moscow flat. After discovering the locked door on his return, Gordievsky realized he was under surveillance. Yet, if he had not been arrested at the airport, it meant the investigation was not complete. The next day, he was called to see KGB leadership Viktor Grushko. Budanov was present. Gordievsky later recounted what happened in Grushko's office. According to him, things started like a work boozy gathering. Then he realized something had been slipped into his cognac that made him lose some control. Colleagues began a real interrogation. They claimed to know he was a British spy and tried to extract confessions and details. Gordievsky did what they had taught him to do for such situations. He denied everything. He woke the next day in an unfamiliar bed and was then driven home. The KGB informed him he would not go to London. He was demoted and restricted from accessing current operations. Gordievsky tried to understand why. If the KGB knew of his ties with MI6, he had not yet been arrested. The only logical answer was that they lacked solid evidence and were still seeking it. Meanwhile, in London, a Soviet embassy employee came to Layla and said to pack. Her husband had taken ill and they needed to fly to Moscow immediately. MI6 saw this and assumed an arrest had occurred. They set the Pimlico plan to full readiness. Gordievsky realized his time was limited and that the KGB would soon find proof of his collaboration. He needed to make a decision. The Pimlico operation initially envisaged the escape of the entire family, 2 adults and 2 children. Gordievsky had to either tell Layla about the planned escape and obtain her consent or flee alone. He hinted to his wife about a possibility of escape and gauged her reaction. Based on her response, he concluded he could not trust her and made the painful decision to flee alone. Once Pimlico was fully activated, a British embassy staffer daily at 7:30 a.m. passed the designated bakery on Kutuzovsky Prospect in expectation of the man with a sea bag. Finally, one morning carrying a Mars bar, he spotted the man. They stared at each other for several seconds, and at that moment Gordievsky's exfiltration officially began. He returned home, soaked the pages of his Shakespeare volume, and studied the escape details. On Friday, July 19, 1985, wearing a tracksuit, Gordievsky left his apartment. Knowing he was watched, he pretended to go for a run, escaped surveillance, slipped into the metro, and took a night train to Leningrad. He arrived early on July 20th, took a local train to Zelenogorsk, then a bus toward Vyborg, and got off at a remote stop called the 836th kilometer. There he was met by cars with British diplomats. They themselves had barely shaken off KGB surveillance. But the hardest part lay ahead, the border crossing. The diplomats came in 2 cars, prepared as if to evacuate an entire family. Gordievsky was stripped, treated with a special solution to deter guard dogs at the border, and hidden in the trunk. The British had fully prepared the escape and even took a diplomat's small child to potentially distract border guards. They were stopped for document checks at a Soviet checkpoint before the Finnish border. A guard walked by with a dog. After several minutes of nerve-wracking waiting, the car was allowed through. If Soviet border guards had checked the trunk, they would have found Gordievsky curled up and nearly naked. A few days before his escape, Aldrich Ames betrayed the names of 24 KGB spies, one of them Oleg Gordievsky. To this day, it's unclear why the KGB did not immediately arrest him. Perhaps Budanov and his team were deliberately slow, trying to collect conclusive proof. The KGB evidently assumed Gordievsky could not escape under constant surveillance. After his disappearance, Soviet services long searched for his body, believing he had committed suicide. Later, when they realized it was an escape, the KGB sought to downplay Gordievsky's access to classified information, claiming he wasn't that important and couldn't have revealed much. Yet the fact that even 30 years later many KGB eyewitnesses refused to discuss the case speaks volumes. Despite diplomatic efforts, Leila Aliyeva and her daughters were only permitted to join their husband and father in Britain 5 years later. Attempts to rebuild their family life failed. 2 years after that, they permanently separated. Their daughters remained in Britain. Leila continues to live between 2 countries.